Hello, my name is Lauren Elaine, and I am the Assistant Director of the Furious Flower Poetry Center at James Madison University. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Ancestors and Inheritances, Legacies in Black Poetry, the Global Edition, celebrating Furious Flower's third anthology, Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African American Poetry. Our first program back in November of 2020 asked featured contributors to talk about how legacy functions in their poetry and practice. If you missed that event, you can view it on the Furious Flower Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Tonight's event extends the conversation, and I'm just going to read a small excerpt from our introduction to the anthology that addresses tonight's theme. While this book is mainly concerned with the future of African American poetry, we are also fully aware that diverse manifestations of Africanness exist across the globe, and these too must figure in how we conceive the future of Black poetry. Though currently residing in the United States, some poets in this book, including Safia Sinclair, Matem Shifro, Lynn Prokop, Shauna Morgan, Samantha Thornhill, and LaDon Osmond, all of whom will be on here tonight, write from their roots in other soil. Their poignant poems take us back to the mother country and to the kindred diasporic space of the Caribbean. These poets offer us a reckoning with loss and separation, as well as their labor to construct authentic identities. Ultimately, they lay claim to an array of multitudinous selves, vulnerable and empowered, embattled and triumphant, scattered and whole, American and part of the larger African story. Thank you so much to the Academy of American Poets and to the Amazon Literary Partnership for sponsoring tonight's event, and I hope you enjoy the reading.
In various places and in different contexts, I've described myself as a Pan-Africanist. It's not an ideological position, although it is a position I hold to ideologically. But it's a fact of my roots and background. I was born in Ghana in West Africa to a Jamaican father, a Ghanaian mother. My father was actually born in Nigeria, the early part of the 20th century, and then lived in Jamaica to Jamaican parents. I grew up in Ghana and in Jamaica, and then I moved to the States eventually, living in South Carolina for almost 20 years. There's a way in which my understanding of myself as a person of African descent and also a diasporic and an immigrant has come to shape my work. In fact, my work then gives meaning to this fact of my history. And the time I spent in South Carolina was defining for me. I had already made significant literary connections to African American history, culture, and literature. Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and of course, the ubiquitousness of African American music and the narrative of the 60s and the 70s of the civil rights movement were very much important to who I was and who I saw myself as. And in defining my identity through ideas developed in Jamaica through Rastafarianism, I wasn't a Rasta, but I embraced the idea of Rastafarianism, its ideological embrace of Africa, through the sensitivity that I had to the pride and to the value of Africa as an African living in the already wrought experience of immigration, that is, the immigration that was born out of slavery. There's a sense in which my work begins to reconcile these multiple experiences and these ideas as they wrestle inside of me, and then in some ways find peace and a focus and an identity inside of me. But there are models for this, whether it's W.E.B. Du Bois, whether it is Marcus Garvey, whether it is Bob Marley and the Wailers, whoever it is that has began to articulate this Africanness in the present moment, this global Africanness. These voices have had value and meaning to me. And these meanings have been part of my family, my understanding of my parents, my grandparents, the world that I live in. I think my poetry reflects that. I think my writing reflects that, because that, in a sense, is my community, that both the diasporic and the African worlds, and the fact of finding the art and the music and the language to tell the narrative of that connection. And instead of thinking of me as telling their narrative of their collection, this broader idea, there is a sense in which I'm telling my narrative, both with its absences and its presences, with its silences and its noises, with its the gains and the multiple losses. I think that shapes my art, and that shapes who I am as a poet in America. I am a subject of Pan Africanism. This is a simple fact of my birth, my nurture, and the choices I have made as an adult in the modern world. In a conversation with 3 African artists and thinkers who were visiting the United States for the first time, and who came directly to Nebraska as part of the Mandela Washington Project, they asked me what it was like as a black person in America. Not just a black person, but a black immigrant to America. I found myself incapable of answering this question without offering a historical accounting of the relationship between America and Africa. My effort was silly. There was simply no time to rehearse this history. But what I conveyed was that without an acknowledgement of the Africanness of America, without an accounting of the origins of the African American in America, it would be impossible to seriously engage the question of race in America, and by extension to engage the question of America. And the core point is that the American understanding of race was shaped by its attitude to Africa. And this view of Africa was totalizing. It was a Pan-Africanist view, a view that for convenience, for economic and colonial purposes, and for the purposes of culture and ideas of religion and ethics, needed to regard Africa as a singular place, an unmitigated space of collective identity, which in this instance was deemed inferior, uncivilized, and could be declared the homeland of a people who had no rights the white man was bound to respect. And so, in my conversation with the 3 African artists, I was trying to help these young people appreciate that all Africans were being totalized by America's history. And this process has not changed. America's memory, locked in its constitution, its amendments, and its constant challenges and invocations of history, and its wholly ingrained sense of a Bill of Rights, is evidence that the present is defined by the history. And so an African immigrant coming to America is not really a stranger. That person is part of a long history of Africa in the world. My point was that the narrative of Africa as a place from which to escape is ingrained in the psyche of Africans living outside of Africa. And this was a convoluted way of saying that the history of Africa, in all its complexity and with all its elements of totalization, was integral to any understanding of America. And any narrative of the African American is constructed around the idea of origins, the idea of the beginning, the idea, in other words, of Africa. Africans around the world have come to invoke an Africanness of dignity and value to press against the totalizing insults of white supremacy. Whether it is the transformation of Christianity into a belief system that positions the African as the true child of Israel in Negro spirituals, or whether it is the persistent and fiercely proud communities of Maroonage in the Caribbean, and even in places like the low country of South Carolina, where, left to their own devices, Africans constructed societies predicated on African traditions, practices, and aesthetics that were preserved despite the horror of erasure that slavery sought to be, or whether it was the emergence of active and provocative religious belief systems like Voodoo, Santeria, and Pocomania that all self-consciously and with full deliberateness celebrated the Africanness of their identity and culture, the principle remained the same. Africa was to be valued. Africa was a source of grace and power. Africa constituted a force to resist the erasure of white supremacy.
In terms of my own roots and history, my family on both sides stretches back as far as any can recall in the Nile River Valley. Both of my parents are Coptic immigrants to the United States who came here in the late 1960s, and I was raised primarily in California, but have lived across many places within the U.S. I think in terms of the influence of African American and diasporic legacies and how they manifest in my work, I think certainly as an adult I've engaged in a kind of global Black or Pan-African aesthetic or sense of community, and that has been centrally influenced, I think, by African American poetics. I think that especially as an emerging writer in this country, it was African American and Black poets who showed me that there was a way to stretch language, to push aesthetics, to create a space, to tell one's own story and to locate oneself within not only this specific geography, but within a kind of larger transatlantic space. And I think it has been one of the most hugely influential pieces in the shaping of my own work, and one that I have felt from the very beginning, from my first debut book, having an introduction from Sonia Sanchez, for example. It's one that I feel I've been in consistent and regular conversation with, in, again, a kind of shaping and understanding of a more global sense of Blackness, of an understanding of the nuanced histories of both Africa, African America, and the African diaspora. And I think poetry has been an incredibly burgeoning space to allow for those myriad traditions, aesthetics, points of view to kind of come into fruition and to help shape our own thinking and our own work around this. And Furious Flower has certainly played a very central role in the shaping and convening and coalescing of those voices across what I would call the whole of the Black diaspora. So to speak of it as a central influence, I think, would be an understatement. It is a thing that I'm deeply embedded in and in conversation with, and that has uplifted me both at a communal level and certainly at an artistic level and at a level of practice. An excerpt from On Noticing, Notes on Aesthetic Ambition and the Post-Colonial Poet. So to look specifically at the art of poetry, we as poets know that this art comes with great devotion and dedication. It is an art of quietude and contemplation. Poetry is a maligned art, especially in this country, but it is simultaneously an art of great abundance and an art that every human being embodies in one way or another. The goal then of writing poetry is not to become rich or known, not for the sake of acclaim or posture, but rather as a bridge between what was and what is. A bridge that helps reconnect us to our humanity, to make us something new of something very old. This, for likely all writers, but certainly for writers of the African diaspora, seems inevitable. As James Baldwin once argued, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. So in some manner, ours is a project of recollection and resurrection, and our ultimate art is to use this praxis of recollection to become fully human in all of our interactions with one another and the world around us. Again, to work towards noticing. What more powerful way to do this than through our breath? Now, to speak for a moment about my own work as a poet, it is certainly in the broader tradition of what one has called diasporic literature. This is a body of work that seeks to illuminate the experiences and lived realities of transnational, bilingual, and multicultural perspectives, perspectives that are still in large part absent from the mainstream narratives. This is perhaps an attempt at embodying what theorist Homi Bhabha calls a third space. I am clearly influenced by the rich history of American poetics, but I also borrow heavily not just from other global literary traditions and influences, but from engaged research in the fields of history, mythology, theology, ecology, and fields such as ethnomusicology and sociology, all of which help me to see language and the world at large from different angles. Yes, I am arguing here that it is not enough to simply study creative writing. Literature has always been a hybrid of many disciplines, so we must dip into various wells in order to fill our buckets. In a sense, I am arguing here that the ability to create a conceptual framework in literature comes from an ability to more fully realize the nuances and intimacies of our lived experiences as well as what lives outside of them. And I believe this cannot happen with any singular practice.
I was born in Montego Bay, Jamaica, in a tiny seaside fishing village called White House. And the landscape that I grew up around, the beach, the sea, the verdant hills, the lush flora, is one of the biggest influences um, in my work. Um, it's important for me to sort of embody in the line the lush architecture of the natural landscape of Jamaica and the rhythm of the Caribbean Sea, which is always um, in the background of whatever work I'm writing. The Caribbean Sea, it's like a heartbeat beneath the text. And so for me, writing my poetry is a preservation act of the landscape of my island and all the beauty of the island that made me and sustains me. I would also say two of my biggest influences, is actually my parents growing up in a very musical and poetic household. My mother is a huge poetry lover, and she was the first person who pressed a collection of poems into my hands, and she would have my siblings and me memorize and recite poems as very much an oral musical act and as a part of sort of enriching our um, experiences, our childhood. And so for me, she's a big influence in not only that she gave me the passion for poetry and showed me the possibilities of what poetry could be, but also in the way that she is a storyteller. She tells us the stories of our history, of our ancestors, of our lives, and she's always doing this work of preserving the matriarchal language of oral folklore and oral history. And that's something that I'm always inspired by when I write. And I always want to do that same kind of preservation work of the matriarchal language of women like my mother who preserve our histories through storytelling. And then I'm also very influenced by my father. He's a reggae musician. He's a Rastafarian, and he's the Rastas have their own kind of dialect, their own kind of anti-colonial ideas, a kind of linguistic rebellion, and so I'm really inspired in my own work to try to do that kind of anti-colonial critique of Caribbean histories, of imperial systems, of the English language. And of course, that is also fed by the poets who, made it possible for me to come through and write poetry. Poets like Kamal Brathwaite and Derek Walcott. I would say are two of my, giant looming influences as well. And of course, it's an honor being part of this anthology and being included in the diasporic legacy of poetry, but also the legacy of African American poetry and um, African American poets who made way for me as well, and who I count as poets on my family tree who made me the poet I am today. Poets like Audre Lorde, Lucille Clifton, Natasha Trethewey, Rita Dove. These are all poets that I count as huge influences. And it is such an honor to be not only representing the Caribbean poetry of today, but also to be included with people who made space for me and without whom I wouldn't have the word. So, thank you. Hands. Out here, the surf rewrites our silences. This smell of ocean may never leave me, our humble life or the sea, a dark page I am trying to turn. Today, my mother's words sound final, and perhaps this is her first true thing. Her hands have not been her hands since she was 12, motherless and shucking whatever the sea could offer, each day orphaned in the tide of her own necessity, where the men o' war ballooned, wearing her anchor of a heart, her face reaching, mooring for any blasted thing. Sea roach and black-haired kelp, jeweled perch or a drop of pearl, made with her smallest self, her night prayers a hushed word of thanks. But out here, the salt depths refuse tragedy. This hand-me-down life burns sufficiently tragic. Here, what was cannibal masters the colonial curse, carved our own language of the macabre, sucking on the thumb of our own disparity. Holding her spliff in the wind, she probes and squalls, trying to remember the face of her own mother, our island, or some strange word she once found amongst the filth of sailors whose beds she made, whose shoes she shined, whose guns she cleaned, while the white bullet of America ricocheted in her brain. Still, that face she can't recall made her chew her fingernails, scratch the day down to its blood. This rusty sunset of this wonder, this smashed archipelago, our wild sea grape kingdom overrun, gold and belonging in all its glory to no one. How, being 12-fingered, she took her father's fishing line to the deviation and starved of blood what grew savage and unwanted, pulled until they shriveled away, two hungry mouths askance and blooming, reminding her that she was still woman, always multiplying as life's little nubs and dreams came bucking up in her disjointed. How on the god teeth she cut this life, offered her hands and vessel to be made wide, made purposeful, her body opalescent in all our clamoring, our bloodline of what once lived and will live and live again. In the sea's one voice, she hears her answer. Beneath her gravid belly, my gliding hull, a conger eel.
from Clarendon, Jamaica, in a very rural district in Clarendon. A place called Gravel Hill is where my umbilical cord was buried at the root of a cherry tree. And I was raised in a community of very politically engaged people. My parents were community activists who raised my siblings and I with a Black consciousness that was globally engaged. And so at a very young age, I was aware of this. I had the sense of political struggle and what that meant in Jamaica, what it meant in Cuba, what it meant in the United States, what it meant on the continent. And I was also very aware of what it meant for Black women. I was surrounded by women. My mother and her sisters and her cousins and aunties of every kind in the community were women who shaped me. I hear their laughter, their songs, their weeping still. That's something that remains in my memory. It's something that shapes me still to this day. And when my family and I moved to the United States, those things that I had heard about as a child, about the experiences of Black women in this country, became a very different kind of reality, right? Because then I began to experience them, and those things shaped me. And so all of that has shaped my writing, right? And one of the things that was a very early memory for me was coming to the United States and having this accent and people being very aware of that and asking me things. But then at the same time, Jamaican children in the US would make fun of my country, Bakabush Jamaican patois. And so I became sort of hyper aware of my utterances, became very quiet. But always I resist that because I remember the voices of those bold women in my family. I know and have read the voices of bold women right here in the United States. And in my poetry, I move or attempt to capture that, to seek it out, to explore it, linguistically, corporeally, in the natural world. Really, I think that is my legacy and my heritage, is those voices of women, their experiences, all the intimate the things that threaten to, stay hidden or quiet. Those are the things that I attempt to excavate, and they're very much shaped by this space, right, in which I'm anchored, both to that cherry tree and to this U.S. American experience.
Resume names. We gave them resume names. I had a different list and lingered on every letter, enunciating and singing each syllable, whispering at first, then shouting them, laughing them out, feeling the way they vibrated on my tongue and blew from my lips. Then I read each meaning, searched for a root, something free, anchored only by legacy and heritage, Black and brown names scented by bissap and masala, flavors to anoint tiny feet and wrinkled heads of dark hair, bundles wrapped in batik and kanga, mouths rooting at my breasts. I wanted names as dark as my areola and the insides of my mother's thighs, strong as an umbilical tug, sharp as the contractions that drew them out, determined as my will, more unyielding even than his last word.
My mother and the 3 to 4 generations before her are Arabs from the Maghreb, born and raised in Morocco with roots extending through Morocco to Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal, where our earlier ancestors likely underwent a process of Arabization when the Arabs moved west into the north of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. This line of my people, though firmly African in a geographical sense for as long as we know, have been integrated into and have come themselves to cultivate a narrative of identity that firmly situates us in Arabness, in a notion of Arabness that exists somehow fundamentally separate and apart from a Black identity or an African identity. This identity narrative would see us aligned with the Mediterranean, and at least within my own family, as a result, I believe, of French occupation some centuries after the Arabs arrived in North Africa, a Francophone or European idealization of self. As the US-born child of such an African immigrant, both Arab and from the North, and as a mixed-race individual, my father is Irish-American from New York City. My very life, its terms and its texture, is testament to the centrality of this question around African American and diasporic legacies. In my work, I have endeavored to put into conversation Morocco's multiple colonial legacies and US American racial politics as my spirit, mind, and body carry both and participate in both, just as the two lines of my family participate in and represent both. My work, though US American in nature and origin, is at once necessarily animated, populated, and given life by the Maghreb and its Black history, which in turn infuses a contemporary notion of Blackness in the United States. I'm not interested at all, in my work or otherwise, in claiming histories that are not my own. I'm interested in the moments when, or really the generations for whom, histories merge, bridges form, revising answers we thought we had, and truths we thought we knew. African American and diasporic legacies that are manifest in my work, inasmuch as in my work I try to emphasize the moment of their union, their interdependence, as represented by my family's story and the story of so many families like mine, where the non-American begins to become the American, and the American begins to become the non-American. It is this very nexus in which my work and indeed my life exists, and which I hope to contribute to our ongoing discussions of who we are as an evolving nation, both pained and possible. The maker has marked another boy to die. His thin body between two sheets, black legs jutting out onto the stone floor, the tips of his toenails translucent as an eye. Gray clumps of skin, powder light, like dust on the curve of his unwashed heel, and the face, swollen, expanding like a lung. At its center, the sheet lifts and curves, his body's strangeness, even there. One palm faces down to show the black surface of hand, the other facing up, white as his desert sky. As if underwater, he passes from that room into the blue porcelain silence of the hall, where the light-skinned women have gathered in waiting. No song of final parting, no wailing ripped wholly from their throats. The women do not walk into the sun. They hide their bodies from it, those pale wrists, those pale temples. They do not walk the streets. They do not clutch their own bodies. They do not hit themselves in grief.
I'm a small American poet, and I think the thing that I consider the most is a sense of dislocation and experience a regular sense of haunting in the landscape, and part of that haunting is yearning. And so the way that diasporic storytelling and diasporic artifacts, which includes books and is probably primarily literature for me, the way that that helps me keep going, formulate thoughts, construct a sense of self, but also construct a sense of self making things, has been incredibly essential. I don't know how I would have made art and how I would have approached literature without that lineage, without that heritage. But more importantly than that, I don't know how I would have done my human work, and I don't know how one would survive this place as an outsider, as a stranger, and as an estranged person without that tradition and without that help, without that handhold. Parable for refugees. 17 common flies, clustered, hallway, days. They no longer fly through the screen when ushered. Week, to, from, light, real, artificial. Did they forget the sun? Fly toward faces, some dead on a sill, some walk. Did they forget how to fly? Why don't they go? One paces on a step. Do they wait for a shoe? It averts them. Goes. Why die still? Is it madness? The ones who wait.
So as a poet of Trinidad and Tobago that has been residing in the US for over 30 years, my identity as a poet was formed in the US. So as an Afro-Trinidadian poet, since college, I've been steeped in the African-American literary tradition that has shaped my work immensely. I've also frequently traveled to places such as South Africa and Swaziland, and this triangular trade of my travels has also informed the context and the scope of my work. I began writing poetry as a child, right before I started listening to rap music, and my affinity for hip hop has influenced my diction, cadence, sense of wordplay, and overall sensibility. In fact, after falling in love with the work of Tupac Shakur, I went through a period of writing my own rap lyrics, and the process that I developed of reading my lyrics out loud as I produced them onto the page, just to make sure that the words danced in my ear and heart, this is the same process that I use to write poetry to this day. Also, it was after reading the work of Zora Neale Hurston that I gave myself the permission to explore writing poems in Trinidadian English. The work of Gwendolyn Brooks and Lucille Clifton helped me to expand and to deepen my subject matters, as well as to take certain stylistic risks. As a result, my body of work carries a versatility that I find is reflective, reminiscent of the diverse voices and approaches that writers across the diaspora employ to contribute to the global archive of Black imagination and life. Bring back. Bring back the milk cartons. Airbrush them with brown girls. Bring back our girls with invisible skins. Bring back our lost in the sauce, the done up and dressed down, our around the way girls from Nigeria, Atlanta, South Africa, and the Bronx. Dredge them up from swamps on the hills of capitals. Bring back search parties, flashlights big like disco balls. Bring back the bat signal, Amber Alert the whole diaspora to the town hall. Bring back those downcast and palpitating stars for eyes. Bring back our boys from closets, corners, and chalk lines. Bring them back from graves and cracks that have swallowed them. Bring back our fathers from wars and lions' mouths. Bring our mothers back from the holes in their hearts. Bring back our covalent bonds. Bring back the village, each face braided into its memory. No pamphlets, no posters. Bring back, oh, Keita missing? Girl, she been at Darius's house since school let out, child. Bring back the souls of child snatchers and traffickers, CEOs, public figures, and holy men who leave their masks chattering on nightstands of rooms wallpapered by translucent girls no truckload of milk can save. Bring them back to their families. Bring back our girls to their mothers who weep. Bring our lost ones back to the warm or cold beds they left made or unmade. Bring them back into the dreamless arms of sleep.
So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the my non-American roots. You know, I'm from the Caribbean, where we think of America as the whole continent. So I'm imagining that this question is about the difference between my experience as a Caribbean person and someone who maybe has a lineage, a Black lineage, and African American lineage in the United States. For me, well, I was born again in the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean. And for me, Blackness is very much shaped by a consciousness of maroon culture and community, of music and embodiment and dance, particularly salsa and merengue and compás, and the traditional musics and songs. So being in the United States and having migrated to the United States, to New York, outside of New York City, to Mount Vernon, New York, which, you know, I came to understand was a place where hip hop really came to life. That very much shaped my experience to be living in a place where hip hop was defining culture, hip hop was defining sound, hip hop was redefining poetry. And this is in the early 90s, you know, when hip hop is emerging within the commercial sector at a whole other level. That experience very much formed a foundation for me of being a young poet in a hip hop context. And then as I kept growing and getting to know Black artists, Black American artists explicitly, I was very much influenced by the work of Zora Neale Hurston and then also Sharon Bridgeforth, both who are Southern Black artists, Southern African American artists. And that is significant because as a Caribbean person, there are things that translated across our landscapes and that somehow created a bridge for me as a circum-Caribbean peoples, as a peoples who are connected to the Gulf and the waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf. And so I think of my work oftentimes in conversation with theirs. I think of my work as influenced by hip hop and the hip hop era, and specifically Sonia Sanchez, who taught me many years ago to be, you know, to study rhyme and to be good about rhyming, right? To really be diligent about form. So I have these African American artists to thank and this context to thank as a non-African American Black person, in particular because of the vast creativity and creative imagination that has fed the ground here that then I get to step into as a migrant from the Caribbean and to learn from and to grow from. Each night, square of light, sliver of moon, your hand directs my breath. I breathe in and out against your neck, your bronze shoulder. We divine new meaning each night, our legs entwined, our bodies singing songs from magic stars, swimming on the ground underwater. You twirl me on your fingers, you conjure springs from my flesh, clouds cannot help but form above us. We are divine each night, a new song rises from our entwined bodies, stars lend their magic to form the ground, the water of us.
I am Caribbean American. That's how I identify. As was mentioned in the poem, my parents immigrated to the US from Trinidad and Tobago in the early 70s. Du Bois talks about duality of black folks, but I kind of felt like I had like my foot in like three different worlds. Having a Caribbean upbringing, parents with Caribbean values, as well as being an American, and also being seen as a black American. You know, being Caribbean American meant going to school, and my African American friends who we call the house, you know, would always ask, you know, why do your parents sound funny? Where are they from? It meant holidays where we embrace both Caribbean foods and traditional American foods. So for Thanksgiving, we'd have like the typical American stuff, the turkeys, the cranberry sauce, all of that stuff. But then right alongside that would be, you know, duck, would be curry goat or beef, callaloo with crab legs. So my childhood has always been a mix of Caribbean and American culture. One way that both my American and Caribbean roots come up in my poems is through food. You know, if you read a lot of my poems, the presence of food is abundant. I never really took to calypso, soca. I grew up loving hip hop. So I guess that's the American part of me. But what I've taken from my Caribbean culture is the food. Like I love to cook. I learned to cook hanging around my mom in the kitchen. And so a lot of the dishes that I grew up on, I'm now cooking for my daughters who are Afro-Caribbean American. You know, their mom is Nigerian and I'm Caribbean American. So they get the Caribbean side of their culture from the foods that I cook for them. But the American part, when people see me and they don't know who I am or they don't know my background, just on the surface level, I'm seen as an African American. The bias is toward black people in America, you know, automatically gets heaped onto me. My poems, you know, I'm dealing with police harassment, but then there's also a lot of black pride in it too, because, you know, being fortunate to be in a predominantly black county, Prince George's County, and coming up in a school system that really made sure that we got a good dose of our black history. There's also some black pride in my work. So I'm honoring Nelson Mandela, Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, and other historic black figures that have, you know, been trailblazers in my life. Sugar Shack for Ernie Barnes. Looking at Sugar Shack by Ernie Barnes in early November, I stared at women whose backsides curved like hooks. The men, snapping their fingers and stretching skinny limbs, were a school of fish swimming among anglers. They existed in a world of oil and canvas. They danced as if it was the 1970s, the decade my parents immigrated here from Trinidad. U.S. soldiers were already dying in South Vietnam's rice paddies. My mom wore a white dress with a train. A rice cloud followed my parents from the altar to church doors. I was looking at Sugar Shack, staring at women swing and slide as if a flame slithered down their spine. I walked through the frame of the painting where Marvin Gaye's banner hung from the ceiling. I crossed the frame like the threshold of a house. Marvin Gaye singing through cracks and pops on a 145. A woman who sounds like my mom laughs at a shadow shaped like my father. Then bed springs moan. Marvin's serenade cracks and pops. The 45 moans like the lovers in the next room, giggling while they made me. I was looking at Sugar Shack, staring at women whose jelly rhythms turned men into toddlers, learning the shapes of things, having forgotten their names. I walked through the frame and saw my parents single, staring at each other through the crowd.
As a poet with roots outside of the United States, I feel humbled to be receiving different narratives from my ancestors because my lineages are so divergent and convergent in many different ways, whether I know them or not. I specifically have ancestry and diasporic legacy in both African and African American roots and cultures and traditions, which make my attempt in storytelling, specifically through poetry, very exciting, impactful, very humbling, quite humbling at times, and extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily imaginative. My poetry is only my poetry because of my elders, because of my antecedents from all different cultures and backgrounds that I come from. And it is because of them that I'm able to even use and wield the languages that I do, the way that I do, and to continue to evolve in my narrative, in my storytelling, in my thinking, and my freedom to exercise that sort of thinking through poetry, which at my stage, in my community, in my family, in myself, I find it to be a big privilege. The silences. Ancestor mothers approach slowly, silences I have assumed in my body. They speak a language I have learned to hide deep into my bones. They call me daughter, but I'm also a mother. In this, we all interchange dark blues and blue blacks, dirty greens adorning our kinks. Each of them hands me an item I forget to store. A seed, the beginning of a wall, a black dress, a child, a white natala. I see me and my head is shaved, body thin cracking, limbs long. I open my mouth and hiss in a language I do not recognize. They wash my mouth with kakti and let me drink their milk. They call me daughter again, and again I say, I am a mother, but do not know how to stop being a child. To this flesh they feed honey and kita and warm milk. They sew my wounds and cover my scars with palm leaves. They call me Ade, Ababa, and I am small and stubborn and yellow-green all over.
Well, I'm from Panama, and I came to the United States when I was 17, and I've been here ever since. I've gone back to visit Panama several times, but I have essentially been calling the United States my home for a little over a decade now. But I still am a proud Panamanian and consider myself to be a Panamanian American writer. I would say that, I'm influenced by writers from throughout the diaspora, and I consider African Americans to be part of the African diaspora. So my influences range from Afro-Latino poets like John Murillo and Elizabeth Acevedo, to Afro-Caribbean poets like Derek Walcott, to African American poets like Terrence Hayes, A. Van Jordan, and so many more. Ode to the Japanese radio, oozing hot tunes on a hot afternoon of my childhood at age 4 in La Ciudad de Panama, at my abuelo's house. Ode to the black women made of air and imagination, who Pito and I danced with in his living room in La Rosita, the rosy part of Rio Abajo, known for turning bullets into blooms. Ode to La Olwa Bras, the early 90s Brazilian siren in Kaoma, who seduces us into dancing with our dream girls and away from the bullet-bitten bodies plastered across the front page of La Crítica News. Ode to the famous mulatto melody howling from the bellows of the accordion on the record, and to the Portuguese words I pronounce in near Spanish as I try to sing along to the forbidden dance song. Ah, recordas thou, vai estar com ela onde for. Ah, recordas thou, vai estar pra sempre onde for. There isn't much forbidden in my family, except piedra and hierba and the tiroteo from their trade. There isn't much forbidden in my family, except pistolas and secuestros, chanchudos y corruptos who've become piedra's slaves. Pito and I save the negras in our arms from piedreros, drug dealers, and the cartel with our moreno swing hips, dips, and spins to the 2-beat carimbo drum rhythm, stronger than the pulse thumping through my little boy body until I can't tell the difference between my corazón and the radio's tong-tong, until our dream girls become real women, until we've praised, danced our world back to being one that little brown black boys like me can believe in.
So, both of my parents are from the Caribbean. My father is from Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. That happens often. My mom is from Barbados. As you can see in the background, this is a picture that I took while I was in Barbados. So, a lot of my work as a poet is about exploring the cross cultural influences across the diaspora. As someone who was born in Brooklyn, in New York City, but having Caribbean heritage, I'm often in this kind of in between of being immersed in Black American culture in the United States, but also having influence from my Caribbean heritage. So oftentimes I'm exploring the interconnections between the various cultures that I engage with. And so I've found a lot of interesting unexplored history through a lot of research. For example, there's historical connections between Barbados and the Carolinas, the Geechee Goa culture in the Carolinas, uh, carnival traditions in the Caribbean, like Junkanoo, that's in the Bahamas, has also shown up in places like Virginia and the Carolinas. Hip hop, of course, is a fusion between Southern Black American culture and Afro Caribbean culture. There have been historical figures from the Caribbean who have been a part of influencing Black American culture in the United States, such as Marcus Garvey, um, Malcolm X. His mother is from the Caribbean or has Caribbean heritage. Even Cicely Tyson, who recently passed away, is Caribbean American. So there's a lot to be explored there, and I want to do more of that in my work. Thank you. Voyage of Kianda, from Angola to the Caribbean. Art formerly known as the Sable Venus speaks back. Searching
for a name, unremembered, made palimpsest, before derivative of blackface, before overwriting mythic past, before whitewashed romance of trade. You rode on top of me, crossing the ocean. I did not steer here on my own free will. My arrival was not filled with ceremony, praise, glory. It was not some pioneering feat to be token black in a sea of white gods. My body and name were the price of entry here. That is revelation, the same revelation of stars guiding this ship. None of the offerings gifted to me came along. Instead, I was made, sacrifice, stripped of nourishment and clothing. One thing I have left is this message dispersed across space and time. From this middle passage, crossing the Kalunga. Let me pull you men of greed further under. I did not come out of a shell, a shining white pearl. Instead, I, black-lipped, came a dove out of the belly of your ship, searching for direction, searching for home, searching for name. I still hover over the ocean, hoping to hear it spoken to me again. No reins were given to me so I could manifest my destiny, except for the ones I have embedded deep within my body, pouring the waste out. I am still holding memory riding me every day, his hand on the small of my back, dancing the samba, stepping one side to the next, my hips moving like Congo cobras riding the waves, the same ones you have used to power this journey here. I remember the way he moved, sweeping the ground with his feet, his back flips and kicks. Now, I hold on to memory any way I can. Kipula and Ngolao to capoeira, taste of leafy greens, okra, fish in kalulu, to karuru and kalalu. Lavo knew it as gumbo, and she held her snake zombie high. I hold on closer with Nzombi and Ivombi, but you whip them into Delphi. Think dolphins are close enough approximations for what they are. But in the roar of waves below, I hear them telling me that isn't so. My home, swallowed by Poseidon, or is it poisondom? Whipped into snake-haired savage of nature, chimpanzee, my word you use. Whipped into babbling fool, baboon gargoyle. Angola into Anglo-Union Jack. Branded into mockery, branded as Louisiana prison after it was plantation. And you want me to forget my home as the title of ruler. You want me to forget. I resisted as Quilombo and Maroon. I, christened by passage, still cannot forget home, has never left my body, has never left my names unuttered. As a calypso siren, I have been a rainbow wave, a strange form of flight, a wind's whistle, a song. You forget with my songs, I have pulled whole villages down to the bottom of the ocean for their collective delusions. The way you use the Atlantic to pull me in chains. It has never left. Embedded deep within me is my name's urge to flood the world with its force of connection.
Good evening. I'm Joanne Gabin, Executive Director of the Furious Flower Poetry Center. Thank you so much for joining us for Ancestors and Inheritances, the Global Edition, sponsored by the Amazon Literary Partnership and the Academy of American Poets. I want to thank Parnisha Jones, Director of Northwestern University Press, who was the publishing editor for Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African American Poetry, and her amazing staff who helped produce this anthology of the work of more than 100 award-winning poets. I would particularly like to thank all of the outstanding poets who shared their poems and their comments with us tonight. In their poetry, we find an embrace of the dignified and defining inheritances of the African diaspora, and a collective assault on notions of white supremacy that would demean and erase the philosophy, languages, and cultures of African people. Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African American Poetry, is the third anthology coming out of Furious Flower, and you can purchase it now at a generous 30% discount at the Northwestern University site using the promo code Furious Flower. Please encourage your colleagues and friends to purchase this book. We would love it. To learn more about Furious Flower and our upcoming programs, like our Summer Legacy Seminar on poet, publisher Haki Matabuti, and our Facebook Live reading series, visit our website at www.jmu.edu/FuriousFlower, and please follow us on social media. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I'd especially like to thank all of those who are joining us from places around the world: Trinidad, Jamaica, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and South Africa. All of you, please stay safe.